One of the questions I get about the Olivet Discourse is verses 36 on from in Matthew 24, where Jesus says, "But about that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only." People want to know if there is a transition in that verse from looking at the events of 70 AD and the destruction of the temple to now a future reality. And commentators are really split on this. You'll see some that lean into preterism a little bit more heavily, and they will assert that yes, this is a continuation of 70 AD. Christ is talking now about the day of 70 AD, that nobody knows when that specific day, when the fall of Jerusalem will take place. Only the Father knows that. And others will say, no, there's a clear transition in language here, where Jesus is now speaking to a future time at his return. He's speaking now of the end of the age. Now, I've wrestled through this deeply. I really have, and it has been a difficult decision to make because it seems that there should be a continuity talking about 70 AD, and it seems that this kind of disrupts some of that continuity. However, as I studied more, I have come to a very firm conclusion that Jesus is indeed switching the conversation from the events that are going to take place in this generation, spoken to his disciples, to now looking into the future and speaking about that day, the end of the age, the day when everything comes to a close and the eternal state is ushered in. And he's speaking to that now in verse 36 onwards. And so I kind of want to explain the exegetical reasons that I have for taking that position. I'm not going to go through a verse-by-verse thing this time, but I just want to explain why I think that interpreters should recognize a clear and distinct transition there. And the first thing I want to do is I want to go to Matthew 24. I'm actually going to use mostly Mark's account of the Olivet Discourse for this. But if we go to Matthew 24, it's very important the questions that are being asked of Jesus. The disciples say, "Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So there are really three questions there. Some will say it's two questions. I think it's really three questions. And maybe it was two in their minds, but it's a three-question answer. Christ answers their questions as though they were three distinct questions because of the confusion that I think they had when they were asking the question in the first place. So it's very interesting. So Jesus says earlier, when they point out the temple, he says, "Do not see all these things?" And they want to know, when will these things be? So the first question is very clearly linked to the context of the temple's destruction that Jesus had just prophesied about earlier. They want to know when the temple will be destroyed. The second question revolves around the sign of his coming, or the sign of his parousia, his presence. And what's interesting about this is that most people immediately assume second coming, and so they link the coming and the end of the age all to the second coming. And then there's commentators who take the 70 AD approach that link both the coming and the end of the age to 70 AD. But I think we need to be very careful about linking those two things together simply because the disciples do. Because I think Jesus Christ's answers basically speak to the fact that there is a distinction between these two things, even if there wasn't one in the minds of the disciples. So, when will these things be? When will the temple be destroyed? Secondly, what will be the sign of your coming? They want to know when Jesus Christ is going to be coming before the Ancient of Days to receive the kingdom, as is seen in Daniel. And so the disciples, knowing that Jesus has constantly referenced to himself as the Son of Man and has constantly said that he's going to be going to the Father, they want to know when this parousia is going to take place. When will this advent be? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? And again, very important to note, the sign is mentioned both times. So they recognize that they need a sign of his advent because they will not necessarily physically witness it. There's a recognition that going to the Father is a very abstract meaning. How will they, his presence is already with them. His advent, if you will, is already with them. So for them to ask about the sign of his advent indicates that they recognize he's going somewhere else. And they want to know the sign that this has come to be. And they also want to know the sign of the end of the age. And here's where I think we need to make a distinction. Coming and end of the age are not talking about the future. nor is the coming and the end of the age talking about 70 AD. Rather, it's both. In the disciples' mind, the fall of the temple, the coming of Christ to be king, and the end of the age are all synonymous. They're all going to happen at the same time. But I believe in Christ's answer, he distinguishes the end of the age, which is future and our future, with his coming, which was established at his ascension in the first century. And I think there are some very important keys. So first, as Jesus starts answering these questions, he tells them that they will hear of wars and rumors of wars, and then he says, "See that you are not alarmed, for these things must take place, but the end is not yet." So right there, Jesus makes it very clear to distinguish between these things, the part of their first question about 70 AD, with the end, the end of the age, the last question that they asked. And so Jesus tells them all the different things that will take place that they themselves will witness. And then he says that the gospel must be proclaimed first to all the nations, and then the end will come. So again, he makes it very clear. These things take place, the wars, the rumors of wars, the tribulation, all of these things are going to take place, but don't let that be a sign to you that the end is there. And then he goes on, and he says, "For this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. But the end won't come until the gospel is proclaimed to all nations." So Jesus makes it so abundantly clear, and many commentators just skip over this. Jesus makes it so clear that the end is not to be associated with the events of the first century that is tied up in the question, when will these things be? So what about the sign of his coming? Well, he addresses that. He tells them that immediately after the tribulation of those days. So he's talking about those days, these things, the events of 70 AD, and immediately after that, they're going to see that he is enthroned, that he has become the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, that he reigns over all through the vindication of his death and his resurrection, displayed in the judgment on Jerusalem. He says, how will they know? The sign of the Son of Man in heaven is when all the tribes of the earth mourn. Why will the tribes of the earth mourn? Well, because they will see that one like a Son of Man has come on the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days and has been given the authority to judge. In other words, Jesus will be proved to be the Messiah that he claimed to be, that they put him to death. And they will mourn because they will recognize that they are under the judgment, not just of Jehovah that they have in their mind, which is distinct from Christ, but of Christ himself, who is Jehovah. This is the sign of his coming. And notice that he ties this to the first century, ties this to the events of 70 AD. And then he says, truly, this generation will not pass away until what? All these things take place. Very interestingly, Jesus omits the idea that the end will take place within this generation. Jesus says these things will take place in a generation. So what about the end? Well, he says, concerning that day and hour, no one knows. So now Jesus has transitioned. He's answering the third part of their question in verse 36 of Matthew 24. Now, some would still say, Jonah, but there's no way to fully prove that Jesus is not still talking about 70 AD. There doesn't seem to be a clear indication. Well, I think verse 35, where Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour, those need to be taken together. Jesus is speaking about heaven and earth passing away, then speaking about his words not passing away, and then speaking of the day that heaven and earth pass away as a day that's unknown. He's tying the passing away of heaven and earth to the end of the age, which is distinguished from these things and his coming that were asked about in the initial questions. And I think the cherry on top for me in establishing this transition to now speaking about the end of the age is found in Mark's account of the Olivet Discourse. In verse 32, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Jesus then tells his disciples, be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore, stay awake. For you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. Verse 37, and here's the key. And what I say to you, disciples, I say to all, stay awake. So now we have a very clear reference, and I'm always hounding the pronouns. Jesus tells the disciples, when you see this, when you see this. We can't apply that to a future great tribulation because Jesus is using you in relationship to the disciples. But here in Mark's account, we have a very clear transition where Jesus says, what I say to you, disciples, I say to all. And this is recorded in Holy Scripture, and brothers and sisters, we are included in that all. All of us are called by Jesus Christ to stay awake, for we do not know the day or hour. So I believe that there is a very clear transition in this passage to answer the third part of their question, which is the sign of the end of the age. And he says there really is no sign to the end of the age. The end of the age will come on a day that nobody knows. So our duty is not to look for signs. Tell that to our dispensational friends. Our duty is not to look for signs. Our duty is to stay awake, to be vigilant, to be workers unto Christ, and to go, therefore, on his authority to disciple the nations, because Jesus does say, the only thing he says is that the end will come when the nations have been evangelized. When the nations are discipled, when the gospel has gone to all nations, then the end comes. So within the Olivet Discourse that so many commentators miss, there is a distinction in Jesus' answer between the three things asked of him. And when he points to the end of the age, he doesn't talk about things getting worse and worse and worse. In fact, he says that when you see things looking really bad, that is not a sign of the end. These things must happen, but the end is not yet. So when does the end come? When the gospel has conquered the world, brothers and sisters. And that is why he tells us to stay awake. Because we don't know when that'll be. We don't know, is it going to be 100%, 80%, 90% of humanity? We don't know the numbers. Our duty is to be faithful, to stay awake, to be vigilant. Because we don't know the day and hour. And so I think that this is the most reasonable way to read the text. Jesus gives a bunch of signs for the things that will happen within that generation. And then he says, nobody knows this day and hour. Now, if this is talking about 70 AD, it doesn't make sense for him to give all these signs to point to 70 AD, only to follow it by saying, yeah, there's no signs. So clearly there's a transition, and I believe we're now looking into the future at the end of the age, and Jesus doesn't give us an answer. All he tells us to do is be faithful. And so, brothers and sisters, my challenge to you, stop focusing on when the world will end and start focusing on making disciples of all nations, and allow the Father, who Jesus says alone knows the day and hour, to worry about when he's going to wrap this whole thing up. Thanks for watching that video. If you like the work that I do, please consider becoming a patron for as little as $5 a month and signing up for my email newsletter. It's free. Both of those things can be found in the links below in the description. Thank you so much for watching.